So for chapter 11, we'll be covering the urinary system. Some things we want to think about as we go through this chapter. We're going to talk about some of the parts and functions of the urinary system as a whole. We're going to look at the macroscopic and microscopic structures of the kidney. One of the big things we're going to touch on is the 3 processes involved in urine formation. That's something I'd really like you guys to know. We're also going to talk about the kidney and how it's involved in regulating water-salt balance, as well as pH balance of the blood. And of course, as always, we'll go into common disorders of the kidney and how the kidney helps maintain homeostasis in conjunction with other body systems. So if we look at the urinary system, we can break it down into 4 main parts: the kidneys, the ureters, the bladder, and the urethra. The kidneys are these fist-sized organs that have a bean shape. Which came first, the kidney bean or the kidney organ? Probably the organ. But there are these bean-shaped fist-sized organs where we're going to be forming urine. We're not going to store urine here, we're just going to produce it. The ureters are going to connect the kidneys to the bladder. So they're these small little tubes. They're going to carry urine from the kidneys down to the bladder. You have 1 ureter per kidney. The bladder is our storage facility. So it can expand. Remember, it's made of transitional epithelial tissue. And so that's going to allow for expansion to store urine away until you can finally urinate. It's when you would not want to have a non-expanding bladder because you would not be able to hold very much urine at any given point. So it expands to store away as much urine as possible. And then lastly, the urethra, is just the tube that's going to carry urine from the bladder to the outside of the body. Now, this is going to be longer in men compared to women. Men, their urethra is going to have to travel all the way through the penis, whereas with women, there is no penis, and so it's a much shorter pathway. So if we look on the image here, we can see how all these organs are structured, where they are in terms of the abdominal cavity, and how they connect together. So here's our bean-shaped kidneys, where we are going to be producing urine. They're like little urine factories. Sitting on top of them are the adrenal glands. We'll talk a little bit about the adrenal glands in this chapter, but we'll talk more about them later on. Each kidney has a ureter that's going to travel all the way down to the bladder, which is this almost triangle-like shaped structure you see here. And then finally the urethra, which will take the urine from the bladder and lead it outside the body. Some other structures to note is the blood supply to the kidney. Now we have some terms here: renal artery and renal vein. Again, we're talking about direction as well as some structural differences between arteries and veins. But this renal part here, we want to keep in mind what renal is. Renal means kidney. So if you see renal something, you should be thinking about something with the kidney. Like, for example, renal failure is when the kidneys fail. So what are the main functions of the urinary system? Some of these we're going to talk about in more detail than others, but we do want to cover all of the main functions of the urinary system. The main one is excretion of metabolic waste, which we already kind of touched on a little bit already because we are getting rid of urine. We're producing and getting rid of urine. Maintenance of water and salt balance is our second function. Maintenance of pH balance is our third. And then some of the ones that maybe aren't as straightforward is hormone secretion, so renin and erythropoietin, or EPO, as well as the function of reabsorbing filtered nutrients and synthesizing vitamin D. Again, some of these we're going to hit on in much more detail compared to others. So let's start with one of the most important functions, or one of the largest functions of the urinary system, and that's excretion, which we're getting rid of something. And what we're getting rid of is mainly nitrogenous waste. Nitrogenous waste is just a waste product that contains nitrogen. And there's 3 of them that we're going to talk about. Urea. Urea is produced when you break down proteins and then in turn break down amino acids. and this is something that the liver does. So the liver produces the urea. Uric acid is similar to urea, except it is made by breaking down nucleic acids and their nucleotides. And then creatinine, which is made by muscle cells from the breakdown of creatine phosphate. We'll talk about creatine phosphate when we get to the muscular system, so hold tight for that one right now. The main ones you can kind of memorize for now would be urea and uric acid. Those are two that I would hold on to in your memory. The second and third functions were maintaining water salt and pH balance. We want to maintain water salt balance since that helps us maintain proper blood pressure, making sure it's not too high or too low. And then when it comes to maintaining pH balance, blood has a very particular pH range. It's very narrow. We want to stay about a 7.4 on the pH scale. So that puts us at just slightly basic. So the kidneys, to help maintain this pH of 7.4, are going to get rid of hydrogen ions, which are acidic, and reabsorb bicarbonate ions, which serve as a buffer. So the hydrogen ions lower pH. We don't want pH to go lower. We want it to stay around 7.4, and so we get rid of the hydrogen. The bicarbonate can help us buffer the pH here. It can help us kind of maintain a 7.4 much easier. If you don't remember your acids, bases, and buffers, I would maybe go back to chapter 2 to do a quick review. Our fourth one was hormone secretion. We talked about two, renin and erythropoietin. Renin is secreted by the kidneys, and that's going to help the adrenal glands out. The adrenal glands need to secrete a hormone called aldosterone to help the kidneys do their water-salt balance. And so renin can serve as a signal to tell the adrenal glands it's time to secrete aldosterone. Erythropoietin is going to be secreted by the kidneys to tell the red bone marrow to produce red blood cells. We've talked about this one before. We see that erythro, so you should already know that root, thinking red or red blood cells. So this hormone stimulates red blood cell production when oxygen content in the blood is low, right? And that means that there's probably not enough red blood cells or hemoglobin. And I know we've already talked about Lance Armstrong, but we'll talk about him again. He did win 7 Tour de France's. However, he was stripped of those because he was caught blood doping. So he was utilizing erythropoietin, which increases red blood cell production, to cheat, essentially. Remember that red blood cells carry around oxygen, and so if you're performing some sort of endurance activity, having more endurance is going to be helpful. Being able to carry around oxygen is going to be helpful. So he used erythropoietin to artificially increase his red blood cell count. The last function that we're going to talk about is reabsorption of filtered nutrients. We're not really going to get into synthesis of vitamin D, just keep that in mind. But we do want to talk about reabsorption of filtered nutrients. It is responsible for reabsorbing important things that are still usable for us. Things like glucose and amino acids, we can still utilize. So we don't want those to get caught up with the rest of the waste. The urinary bladder is going to store urine away, like we mentioned earlier, and it is expandable. You would not want your bladder to stay very tiny. You would not be able to hold urine very, very long. It does have smooth muscle. So we have a middle layer that's circular and then 2 layers of longitudinal smooth muscle, giving us 3 layers total. And the inside is transitional epithelium. Remember, transitional epithelial tissue allows for the expansion to happen within the bladder. When it fills, there's actually receptors that detect the stretching, and that gives a signal to the spinal cord to say, hey, this bladder is full. We're going to need to excrete this urine out soon. Right, and so we have those stretch receptors that are going to communicate with the nervous system and say, hey, we've stretched to capacity. We need to excrete this urine. And so we communicate from the bladder to the spinal cord. And then up to the brain, if need be. And back down, we can send signals to tell the sphincters, there's an internal and external, to tell the sphincter to open, to relax, and to release that urine. So we're not just holding urine and excreting however we want or just involuntarily. We're communicating with the nervous system before that, right? And that's why you can hold your urine until you can get to an appropriate location, like a bathroom. Some of the macroscopic structures of the kidneys is the renal cortex, the renal medulla, and the renal pelvis. The renal cortex, think of it as an outer layer, this outer kind of shell, but without being crunchy, it's still very soft. The renal medulla is the internal component of the kidney, and it has these cone-shaped tissues called renal pyramids. I'll point these all out on a slide in just a second. And then a renal pelvis is going to connect the renal medulla to the ureter, and it's continuous. It's going to smoothly transition from the renal pelvis to the ureter. So let's look at the kidney. So here we have this coronal, this frontal cut of a kidney. The renal cortex is this outer layer you see in kind of that dark red. And then the renal medulla is going to be this inner portion here. See those individual pyramids? So these are renal pyramids individually. Collectively, we can call that the renal medulla. And see how they all connect? We can't really see it here, so let's go down to this bottom image instead. You can see how those pyramids connect to that renal pelvis. So every pyramid connects with that renal pelvis, and so as urine is formed, it's going to drain into that renal pelvis and then continue seamlessly into the ureter. And then that ureter will carry us down to the bladder.